talk about love. Yeah, I got fears, but I ain't got no love. Yes, I got fears. Fear of plane crash. Fear of car crash. Oh, fear of sex. Fear of alcohol.
So today we're going to talk, well, let me back up. This whole week I'm going to talk about Ted Bundy. So much to get to with this guy. I can't do it in a single sitting. So I believe also his victims, which if you believe his account and most law enforcement account, you're going to say probably around 30 victims deserve their each segment instead of being grouped into all of one. I hope you understand that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down this week in mostly chronological order, and we're going to talk about how Ted Bundy, the serial killer, evolved, and we're going to compare his crimes from the beginning all the way to the end. And it'll be a comprehensive look at what I believe of all the serial killers that I have studied, the most intelligent, methodical, and prepared serial killer that I've studied. He's the most famous, and for good reason, right? I mean, you hate to say success in any vocation will bring adulation and you'll ultimately be known. You hate to give somebody, especially a serial killer of this magnitude, any sort of credibility as into he was good at his vocation, but I mean, he was. And we're going to talk about how he evolved as a serial killer, what made him a serial killer. Now, again, I'm not a psychologist. I don't claim to be. But, you know, I do have some good conversations with people that have talked to Ted Bundy, psychologists that have interviewed Ted Bundy. So I think, you know, for the general cusp of it, we can get into his upbringing, what I see, my opinion, just being, you know, a detective, and how it led to his first killing, how he evolved from that first killing. We're going to use some of Ted Bundy's own words when he confessed to these killings. We're going to talk about confessions. This is going to be a big thing, as in a lot of the confessions have always been scrutinized. You know, I compare this confession a little bit only because I've recently looked into it, is Brandon Dassey confession. Big difference, obviously, between the two individuals. But I'm talking about the actual confession. And what I mean by that is how it is like trying to get information from somebody that has information is sometimes very difficult. Now, some will argue, well, Brandon Dassey didn't have information, he was making it up. Well, the same could be said for Ted Bundy, but no one ever brings that up. And the reason I say that is because he is giving confessions to murders to spare his life, to get another few months. Okay, I'll tell you this. I'll tell you where these remains are located if you give me a stay of execution. Wouldn't that be a good reason to lie, to embellish locations and ultimately have a false confession? I would say yes. So, to me, confessions are very tricky. They always have to be verified. Just as the Dassey confession, there was a lot of things there that couldn't be corroborated. The Bundy case, there's things that he said that couldn't be corroborated. Should we throw those out and just disregard them? I don't think so. I think they need to be looked into further and to explain why those confessions are given. So we're going to get into that about Bundy. And what I find particularly interesting is how he would talk about some of the crimes and some of the dastardly deeds that he committed, but yet others were like untouchable. Why? You might not have an answer for that. I might not have an answer for it, but we'll delve into that. So I'm going to start with my water. No coffee this morning. I already had coffee. Running late this morning because I spent 2 weeks researching Ted Bundy. Now, obviously, I've known about Ted Bundy my whole life, being in law enforcement and being curious about serial killers. I mean, I read books. Read this book recently. Well, recently, I'm going to say within the last 3 years. This is The Only Living Witness. And this was sent to me and signed by the author Stephen Michaud. And I have some connections to Ted Bundy. Obviously, when he was going through his murder spree, mostly in 1974, that's when I was born. And then when he was executed, I believe in 1989, I was in 9th grade. So unfortunately, I never got the chance to interview him or be in contact with him, but I have people that have contacted him. So, Kathy Kleiner. Kathy Kleiner was a victim of Ted Bundy. She was in the Chi Omega sorority house when Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were murdered, and she was also a victim along with another roommate. 2 of them died, 2 of them survived. Kathy was one of the survivors. Bundy beat her, to an inch of her life with an oak tree limb that he had found outside the house, and we're going to get into those murders, weapons of opportunity, planned versus unplanned, organized versus disorganized offender, all of that. But I did happen to meet Kathy Kleiner, spent a significant amount of time with her. We talked about this case. She was her very first guest appearance. I think she does more now, but I was the first to have her at one of my ASOC cold case conferences, and she spoke, and we had lunch, and very surreal moment. It's just much like having dinner with Diane Lake from the Manson family. I've read about these murders and everybody involved, and then decades later, I'm in a position where I can interact, talk to, quiz people from my true crime childhood, and it's a very surreal feeling. Bob Kepler, who was instrumental in the Washington state murders that Bundy committed. We're going to get into all those, but Bob Kepler was a member of my cold case organization, and he was one of the ones that I didn't have to go get. I went out and, much like a football recruiter, college football, I was recruiting the best of the best, and I went out and got Cyril Weck, I got Henry Lee, I got Joe Kenda, Mark Safarik, Jim Clemente, Mary Ellen O'Toole, Joe Kennedy. It's all these people. Yet Bob Keppel, one morning I wake up and I get an email from Bob Keppel. And it said, I think, wondering if you would like to have me as a member of your case organization. Wow, right? You know, I knew who Keppel was from reading about Bundy. He interviewed him, you know, investigated, found some of the remains of the victims. So he sent me his resume. He didn't have to, you know, and so that was my only interaction with him, though. You know, after that, I had very limited, if none, interaction with him. Nonetheless, it was my tie, I guess, to Ted Bundy. So what I gather from Ted Bundy is I've listened to many of his interviews, and he likes to downplay his growing up, his upbringing, and how it didn't have anything to do with his murders. You know how, you know, any good investigator always wants to know why. Now, I'm not just satisfied with somebody coming in and saying, yep, I confess, this is how I did it, and it all matched up. Well, a lot of investigators will say, good, put him in jail and that's it. No. Not Kenny Mains. I want to know why. Why did this happen? Was it rage? Was it anger, retaliatory murder? Was it a lust murder? Those are things that I want to know. Number one, it dampens my curiosity. And number two, it allows me to learn for the next time. So, upbringing, very important. But with Ted Bundy, it's so diverse. You have so many different people seeing different facets of Ted Bundy's life. Some people at his high school, according to Ann Rule, who later wrote a book, I think Stranger Beside Me, and I believe she knew Ted Bundy. I never read the book. But she said when she talked to his high school classmates, they said he was well liked. But yet, I read elsewhere from a neighborhood friend of Ted Bundy's that he was aloof. He didn't fit in. He wasn't well liked. He was false. He would pretend to be bigger than what he was. Say that he hung out with all the athletes and he was a football player when in fact he didn't. And he wasn't very good at the athletics. He was kind of a loner, maybe kind of a social outcast. Ted Bundy himself said, I like to stay apart. I didn't drink. I just didn't get involved in cliques. Now, that part, you know, that's paraphrasing it. But we have to go back a little bit further. Okay, to when he was born in Burlington, Vermont. He was born out of wedlock. So his mother decided, or his mother and his grandparents both decided that the grandparents would raise him, and he was known to think that they were his parents, where his mom was actually thought to be his older sister. Later, he found out the truth of this. Now, do you think that that would have a lasting impression upon somebody? I would surmise that it does. It actually reminds me of a Sopranos episode where Paulie Walnuts is told the same thing. You know, that the person that he lived with, that he thought was his mom his whole life, was actually his aunt, and his aunt was his mom. Doesn't matter, but they reminded me of that. So, according to at least one person that grew up around Ted Bundy in his neighborhood, she said that he would build, like, she described it as tiger pits. I would say that they were like punji sticks from like the Vietnam era, where you would dig out the ground and place sharpened sticks at the bottom of this pit, cover it and then anybody that was walking by would fall in that pit and get stuck. She actually stated that he did this, and then a little girl actually did fall in there and get stuck in the leg. Now, I don't know how true that is. I've seen it from one source, and I typically like to get more than one source to validate information. There was another incident where he would take knives from the kitchen and lay them in the double bed next to the person that was sleeping in there. There, again, it's only, I've heard it once. I don't know the validity of it. But if true, both of those stories are very concerning to me. Now, after they moved from Vermont, they eventually moved to Philadelphia area, I think, for a little bit, and then to Washington, where he grew up. There, his mom met an individual named John Bundy, who would be Ted's father. They adopted him, and that's how he was raised. Apparently, Ted did not really get along with John that well. But it's during this time in Washington where he began exuding behavior that I recognize as a potential for a murderer, and you could be specific and say serial killer. You know, and that reminds me, as I was researching this, I was thinking about, and I want to say this before I forget it, and I'll write it down, but there is more, I know, but to me, Ted Bundy is the first person maybe that I recognized right off the bat that was a serial killer and mass murderer at the same time. How crazy is that, right? I'm sure there's in history a lot more, but he comes to mind right away. He's a serial killer. Now, the definition of a serial killer varies, but to me, you know, more than 3 killings in a prolonged period of time with a break in between. I mean, he obviously was a serial killer. Now, he was not named a serial killer back in the 70s because that term didn't really exist. But he's also a mass murderer, meaning more than one victim at one occasion during a singular event. He did that. Think of the Florida, the Chi Omega. Killed 2, right down the road, injured another, 2 more in the house, 5 victims in one night within a couple hours of each other. So he's a serial killer and mass murderer at the same time. Back to his teenage years. He was known to be a burglar. He was also known to be a peeping Tom. These are all indications of somebody that could progress and evolve into that. Some people will just stop at that. There's burglars, there's peeping Toms, and that's as far as it goes. But in some people, it escalates. Totally different, but the same, is the Manson girls. Think about how they originally went on what they call creepy crawler missions, where they would go into sleeping people's residence and rearrange their furniture. Okay, and that's all they did. Maybe stole something. And then they would wake up in a panic. That evolved to killing. It's different reasonings, obviously, but the same nonetheless, how it progresses. So in 1965, Ted Bundy graduated high school. He did not get, great grades. This myth that Ted Bundy was super intelligent, I believe, is just a myth. Although in their craft, he was very, very well educated. So let's compare that. Let's compare that to a carpenter. He goes to formal school, gets average grades, maybe below average. He's just not interested. What's he interested in? Woodworking. And then he goes and starts working on wood and creates these masterpieces. And people are like, oh my goodness. So he may not be of great intelligence, book smarts in school. He's not interested in that. But what he is interested in is his craft. And that's woodworking. For Ted Bundy, his craft was crime. It was murder. And he became good at it. I would venture to say he was good right from the beginning. His very first victim, who we're going to talk about today, he learned from that, yes, to evolve to a better serial killer. But he was still very good on his first victim. So in 65 he graduates. In 68 he meets this girl named, I believe, Stephanie Brooks. Whether that's an alias or that's her real name, that's what we're going to call her. And he has about a year, maybe 2 years at tops, relationship with her. She breaks up with him because she says he has no ambition. Even though he's joined the Republican committee parties and he worked at a suicide prevention hotline and he enrolled at a law school, she thinks he has no ambition and breaks up with him. That's in 1968. I believe that's the tipping point, possibly, for Ted Bundy. That rejection. Another myth that I want to talk about in regards to Ted Bundy is his looks. Everywhere you see, everyone says he's so good looking. I mean, I don't see it. I don't think he's bad looking, but I mean, are people just comparing him to other serial killers? Like Otis Toole? I mean, compared to Otis Toole, I'm a beauty queen. So I can imagine Ted Bundy in the realm of serial killers is good looking. But is he good looking as a general figure? I don't know. I guess. But it plays such an important factor into why, when he was arrested, people believed he couldn't do it. That still happens today. Even with someone's own confession, they tell you everything. People just will not believe it. All the evidence is there. They will not believe it. Not only just based off of looks, but when they talk to him, oh, he could never do that. He's so nice. Folks, I'm here to tell you, you cannot judge somebody by their demeanor. Everything is false. It's what they portray, that they want you to see. Ted Bundy was a master at this. He was a master manipulator. I would equate him to Charles Manson. He would project back to you what you wanted to hear. That gained their trust. That gained their allegiance. It also shows their vulnerability. And Ted Bundy often said about his victims how he would look for the ones that were vulnerable. And he took advantage of that. And we'll get into all that later this week. In 1973, Ted rekindles this relationship that had ended previously with Stephanie Brooks. He then ended it abruptly. He did. Unlike before. Now, when Stephanie Brooks is talked to, she says that she believes that it was all a charade, him getting her back, all in order for him to end it on his terms. Now, I don't know how true that is, but I found it intriguing enough to include it in this video, because that was at the end of 1973. January 1974, Bundy starts his killing spree. Now, could there have been victims before that? Yes, and we're going to get into that. But right now, in the beginning of this, we're going to talk about confirmed cases. So, his first known attempted murder was January 4th, 1974. And then this was a girl named Karen Sparks. I was going to say Kathy Sparks. And what I want to do here is we're going to talk about his first known victims, first two in this video. Karen Sparks and Linda Healey. And I want to compare them for you to see the similarities, the differences. Did he grow? Did he learn from the first one to the second one? And what's the similarities? And what can we learn from those? So Karen Sparks, she's asleep in her bed. She lives with 3 men, and she lives down in the basement area. Ted Bundy comes in the middle of the night. He beats her with a bedpost. He then... This is hard, okay? Not hard in the sense to talk about. Hard in the sense of understanding. He sexually assaults her, but he uses an object. It's unknown, to me at least, whether it was penile assault or strictly an object. From one source that I read, there was semen on the bed. But it was never tested, and this is long before the advent of DNA. But she was assaulted with something that's called a speculum. Now, I had no idea what this was, so I had to look it up, and it's a gynecological tool that's inserted into the vagina. I could not find out where this object came from. If she was a medical student at the university, I could see, but I seen nothing of that. He used to be a driver for medical equipment, so maybe he stole it. But it brings in such a different aspect, because if this is Ted Bundy's first victim, he's bringing an object with him to use in a house where 3 other people are living. That's very brazen. The whole murder, attempted murder, she survived, thank goodness, is brazen. He sneaks into a house through, I believe, a possible bedroom window that was located above a dresser. He assaults her there, splits her bladder open with this speculum, beats her head in, and leaves her for dead. What does that crime scene tell us? Well, as I can put myself in the investigator's shoes, not much. Not much. My key clue to that would be this instrument. Okay, where did it come from? Talk to the roommates. Anybody have what have you seen this? What's it for? Sex toys. I want to know if she had any sex toys around. Could that have been? It's not a sex toy, but you have to learn where that came from, because that is out of ordinary. Somebody being bludgeoned in their bed in the middle of the night, as grotesque as it is, it's not odd. Okay, that happens. That could be an ex-boyfriend. That could be a current boyfriend. That could be an intruder. Many realms of possibilities. But that speculum, to me, would be key. Because if the offender brought it, that's a planned and organized offender. But what is the murder weapon? Is it a bedpost? Is it a metal rod, as I've seen in some cases, or noted? Is it a crowbar, which Bundy had used later? Because if he's bringing a speculum for some sort of sexual entertainment, is he also bringing a weapon? Is he planning to kill this person? Those are all things that I want to know. But Karen Sparks doesn't die, and she survives. I believe she was 18 years old at the time. Again, that is January 4th, 1974. We're going to fast forward to January 31st of that same year of 1974. So, roughly 26 days later, Linda Healey disappears. She had come home, talked to her roommates, which are females. She goes to bed. 5:30 in the morning, her alarm's going off. It's waking up her roommates because nobody's shutting it off. Roommate goes and looks. She's not there. But the bed is made. Everything looks organized. The whole day goes by. Work calls. Hey, she's not there to do the morning ski report. Okay. She's supposed to have dinner with her parents. They don't see her. Police are called. Originally, when the people looked around the room, they didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But then, and this is why victimology is so very important, somebody notices her bed was made differently than what it usually was. And in fact, some said, hey, on the days that she worked, she didn't even make her bed. That's why victimology is important. So somebody, and I believe it was an investigator, finally goes over and pulls back the bedspread, and what do they find? Blood. They look in her closet. Hanging in her closet is her nightgown with blood. So now what do we have? We have an offender. At the time, obviously, they didn't know if this is connected or not, but with hindsight, we can look back. Now we have an offender who assaults somebody in their bed, which is similar to the previous Sparks case. However, they were removed from that room. They were abducted. But they were assaulted there to begin with. But what is so mind-blowing to me is that Ted Bundy took the time to undress her from her nightgown, redress her in her previous night's clothing, and I'll tell you why I think that's important, hung up her bloody nightgown, then just discard it, throw it on the floor, hung it up, made the bed, and abducted her. Again, very brazen. First of all, breaking into somebody's home when you know people were there, even if they are sleeping, is very brazen. That takes some balls. It is not something that you just do. At some point you do. You have to do it. You have to break your cherry, so to speak. You have to just do it. But I promise you that he had done that previous to both of these. more than likely as burglaries, as robberies. Go in and take something. It escalated. It progressed to sexual assault and murder. Now, let's look at the similarities between these two attacks. Both were attacked at night and in bed. Both was blunt force trauma. They were both beaten about the head. They both look very similar. I hate to lump that together. Both were attractive and had small builds, similar builds. Now this goes back again to what I talked about with Ted Bundy being attractive. Physical attractiveness is a very arbitrary thing. Yet, I believe that the general consensus of people agree what physical attraction is. Now you can't explain it, you can't describe it, but if I showed a picture, let's say of a girl, let's say I showed a picture of Linda Healey, Bundy's first confirmed murder, and I showed that to all the guys in America or the world. We'll stick with America because there's different customs. America. The majority of the men would say she's attractive. So I would surmise, and I would say that all of Ted Bundy's victims were attractive women. They had that in common. But now, what's different? Well, one, the first victim, Karen, was left for dead. The second victim was taken, was abducted. Why the difference? Could be many things. It could be he was scared off in the first murder, attempted murder of Karen Sparks. She had a roommate that allegedly talked in his sleep. Maybe he heard that. Maybe he got scared and left. Maybe it was a planned abduction, but it didn't happen. Maybe it was because he evolved, or he didn't achieve that level of fantasy, that level of excitement that he wanted, that he didn't get in that first abduction or the first attempted murder of Karen Sparks. It's possible that it didn't go as planned. He didn't have enough time to do what he wanted, what he had fantasized all these years about. So with the second victim, Linda Healey, hey, I'm going to take her because I'm going to have my way with her and I'm going to have time uninterrupted. That's a possibility. Linda Healey's remains were found, I believe, in Taylor Mountain, which ultimately, I believe, 6 of Bundy's victims' remains were ended up being located at. So we see here how a serial killer is evolving. Very similar crimes. The difference is, again, being one left for dead but survives. The second one abducted. But the first one, he brings an instrument with him. Now, another similarity that I didn't confirm, but I believe based on his past behavior, is that he was intoxicated for both of these. Now, Bundy later admitted to getting intoxicated a lot of times in order to get the courage up to do these crimes. And we all know that, alcohol, it impairs decision making. I've always said the biggest, stupidest mistakes I've ever made in my entire life, I was under the influence of alcohol. So he had that in common. So does that play a factor in maybe the first attempted murder where he brings an object to use as a sexual assault? I also believe very firmly that he was stalking these individuals. Ted Bundy was a meticulous planner, and he later admitted this. And although his confessions and stuff were very sometimes hard to read, he always seemed to want to talk about himself, more like a biography about him than about his crimes. He was certainly a narcissist and had narcissistic tendencies. I would venture to say, obviously, a sociopath, if not a psychopath, because his non-remorse. Although, it seems like he doesn't want to bring up certain murders for some reason. He says that they are hard to talk about. That seems to some that it could be remorse. It seems to me he did have some remorse. But he described this feeling in him, this urge, almost like he described as alcoholism, like a disease. I would equate it to sex. For the most part, most people enjoy sex. Not so much, not always, the act of sex, but the outcome of sex. The orgasm. That's why masturbation is prevalent. That urge in everybody. Some people, it's every day. Other people, it's a prolonged period of time. They don't need it. But I equate what Ted Bundy is saying about this urge to kill, because that killing gives him sexual gratification. So imagine going without sex, having an orgasm, when you're accustomed to that for a period of time, and it's building up, building up. You can't take it anymore. That is what Ted Bundy felt, in my opinion. And it kept getting easier for him. And that's in his own words. I believe he did show remorse and felt guilty the first couple of times. But then it became almost second nature. And he evolved to the point and then devolved again. And we'll get into that. Almost like an arc of his crimes. He's good. He's good. He's getting things. And then all of a sudden, he digresses, makes mistakes. And we'll get into why he does that, in my opinion, once again. So, Karen Sparks, Linda Healy. I mean, 2 separate murders. I keep saying 2 separate murders. 2 separate incidents. One, the attempted murder. Healy, the murder. Committed by the same individual, Ted Bundy, within the same month of January 1974. He stalked, I believe, both victims. And he talked about, not specifically these two, but how he would stalk people. And although he didn't admit to this with these two, I'm sure that he did. Now, some people will say he couldn't have stalked them. Because if he had, especially Karen Sparks, he wouldn't have went into that house, knowing that she was in there with 3 guys. Well, when that urge hits you and you couple that with alcohol, you become very brazen. And I believe he had been watching her. There was a bar that was close. Ted Bundy lived within 0.3 miles of Karen Sparks. And I'm going to show a map here where Karen's house is, Linda Healy's house, Ted Bundy was staying at a rooming house, and a bar that all three frequented. I am sure that he saw her in this bar, followed her home, stalked her, just like BTK did later on. He did the exact same thing. Would plan it out, see how things are, where they went, case the place, know where he was going to make entry. This being Ted's first known attempted murder is where he would be probably the most meticulous. It probably didn't go as planned. They rarely ever do. Yet, he probably had that planned out the most and was waiting for the best time, or when liquid courage finally kicked in enough and the urge was so overwhelming, he said, tonight's the night. And he probably hid behind a tree. There was a basement level window. He could probably see right in, waited, and then attacked. Still, so ballsy. So ballsy. In that first attack. The second attack, just as brazen, but he takes her. He abducts her. He dresses her. He hangs up her clothing. He makes her bed. So odd. He later stated, because there were some things, why was one of the victims' hair freshly combed and washed? Why did one of the victims' heads, because he decapitated at least half a dozen of his victims. Why did some of them have makeup applied to them? At least one of them. And Bundy was asked about this, and he said, you can do anything you want with them when you have time. Right? So when he has time, he abducts. He has all the time in the world to do whatever he wants to him. And the stuff that he did, the necrophilia, the revisiting of the crime scenes and locations to relive that, the stealing of trophies and giving them away to other people, all classical serial killer tendencies. And he had them. Yet he went undetected for a long time. And a lot of that is because jurisdictional issues. We didn't have the internet, And Ted Bundy, and we're going to get into his trial and whether I feel he should have been convicted or not. He left very, very little evidence at his crimes. I hesitate to say he was a perfect killing machine. Everybody makes mistakes, and he made his mistakes. But thank God they caught him. Because this guy was the worst of the worst. Okay? I still say Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was the most horrific serial killer that I've ever encountered due to his brutality, his penchant of changing MOs. He didn't have a set group of victims. He would kill women. He would rape kids. He would kill and rape men. Didn't matter with him. He was the worst. But Ted Bundy was the perfect killing machine. And thank goodness, through some good investigation, they eventually caught him. So that's all I want to talk about in today's video. The next video, I'm going to go into the next couple of victims and how he evolved, what he did differently, how he progressed, and how he maintained a normal, quote-unquote normal relationship with his girlfriend at the time, all the while being a chameleon and changing into this sadistic, repulsive, reptilian-like creature, all in a matter of a couple hours. Go from a loving family man to this monster, back to a loving family man, much like BTK Dennis Rader did as well. So that's it for this video. Again, this whole week it's going to be all Ted Bundy. What a fascinating creature this guy is. And again, my personal opinions on the death penalty doesn't matter. I just wish that we could have learned more from this guy. We learned a lot. Bob Keppel, the FBI agent Hagermeyer, I believe, and some other individuals did get some great content from him. Yet, it leaves us wanting more. I want to know more about why, how. And we're going to get as much as we can out of him this week. And until next time, next video, sometime this week, and we're going to keep going. Bundy confessed to 30 murders. Some say there was a lot more, but we're going to pretty much cover all 30 murders and what they have in common, and learn from them the best that we can from, unfortunately, the best serial killer at his craft there is, Robert Theodore Ted Bundy. So until next time, Mains out.